as I understand it, your inspiration for writing this book was the trip that you took in 2003 back to Afghanistan. What was it that you saw there that that sort of, I guess, compelled you to write about the women of your country?
Well, I knew I wanted to write about women even before the trip. The trip had really nothing to do with the novel. Even as I was finishing up the KITE Runner, which had turned out, like I said earlier, to my surprise, to be a book about men, really, about love between men, about honor among men, and so on. I really felt like, there's an entire part of that society that is represented in that novel in a very kind of a marginal way because of the demands of the narrative. Not that it wasn't important. So I felt like, there's an opportunity here to talk about women in Afghanistan and try to tell a story about what's happened to women in Afghanistan, because I felt it was so important. It had been represented in news media and on television programs, but I wasn't aware of any fiction that had done it. And I felt that if I tried my best, I could bring some sense of human dimension to the tragedy that is really the story of what happened to women. I feel like what happened to women, and particularly after the Soviets left, is so deplorable in Afghanistan. And one of the great tragedies of the Afghan story in the last 30 years. Women were sold as brides to warlords. They were abducted and sold into as sex slaves. They were beaten. So they suffered not only from the rampant violence that was going around, but also from gender-based abuse. And I thought it was a very important, riveting story. So I had kind of decided that I wanted to write a book about that subject. And then I went to Afghanistan. And when I was in Afghanistan, and largely I went for a personal sense of reconnecting with the country and seeing for myself what happened there, and kind of finding my old roots and so on and so forth, and finding some people that I wanted to see. And when I went there, I spoke to cops and taxi drivers. I spoke to women who were teachers. I spoke to women who were working for NGOs, and even some women on the street. And this picture began to form of the unspeakable hardship that women suffered through, and of their sense of resilience and the inner strength and what it took for these women to survive and hold their families together. Many of the anecdotes and details in the book are based on things that actually I heard that had happened to real people in Afghanistan. For instance, there's a scene in the novel where a woman is pregnant and she has to go and have to have a cesarean section, and she ends up having it without anesthesia, which is something that happened, some of the doctors that I met in one of the hospitals told me happened with regular frequency during the Civil War, when the hospital was packed with the injured and there was no medical supply. There's a point in the novel where a woman, at her rope's end, her husband has died. She's got 6 kids. The Taliban won't let her work. She has no money, and the kids are starving. So she feeds her kids rat poison and takes it herself and solves the problem that way. And that was something that I heard then a couple of days after my arrival in Kabul. So it's virtually everything pertaining to the hardships faced by women has a basis in reality, either that I knew already or things that I saw for myself in Kabul. And when I came back to the States, it was another year before I began writing that book. And although Mariam and Layla are not based on any single women that I met, they are, however, inspired by my understanding of the collective experience of these women and by the collective voices that I heard in Afghanistan. Out of that experience, these two characters were born.
Speaking of voices of women, one of the things I find so fascinating about how you write, Khaled, is you really seem to strive in your books to get inside the head of these characters. And I would presume it's a lot easier to get inside the head of a boy than it is to get inside the head of a girl. Did you have to study at all women in order to be able to emote the way you do with Mariam and Layla?
If all it took was a little study, we'd be living in a much better world. We'd get along a lot better. I'm afraid it's not that simple. I struggled with this. I'm being facetious, but I struggled with this for a long time. I wrote the KITE Runner in just under a year, and I was working full-time as a doctor. I wrote most of 1,000 Splendid Suns having already quit medicine, but it took me 3 years, even though I had much more time. And really the reason for the struggle in writing this novel was in that question, in that I was so afraid of not representing the perspective of these two women in what I felt was an authentic way. I was terrified that people would read the book and see that there's a guy on the pages struggling so hard to sound like a woman. And I kept grappling with the notion that women live in a different atmosphere, that they experience the world through a different emotional filter, that live really in a different arena, and I have to get it. And what would a woman do in this situation? And it was very, very difficult, and it became kind of crippling, frankly. I mean, 2 or 3 times I decided that maybe my agent was right when I called her and told her what I was writing. She said, you sure you want to do this? And I thought maybe she was right. And eventually what happened was I surrendered to it, and I said, you know what, I'm just going to write these characters as if they're people and not worry about gender. Just, write them for who they are in the sense of, focus on their essence. What are their fears? What are their hopes? How have they been disillusioned? How have they been disappointed? What do they want from life? For instance, why does the character Mariam leave the hut where she lives with her mom and go into town and seek her father's love? Why does she commit this act of heroism at the end of the book? And so once I did that, all of a sudden a magical thing happened. I mean, I began to notice that my voice receded from the pages, and the women began speaking through me rather than my voice through them. And that was really kind of a watershed moment for me, and for me, kind of the highlight of writing this book, because then afterward, everything just kind of flowed.
As I understand, this book was required reading for the freshman class here, which is really great. One of the freshmen here, Marianne Sapra, had a question for you, and she asks, what made the Taliban enforce such strict rules on women back then and even now?
Well, I mean, it goes back a long time. The West, especially here in the U.S., we've become familiar with the suffering of Afghan women because of the Taliban, and we became really kind of familiar with the Taliban because of 9/11. So it really started with 9/11. Whereas the reality is that women have had it difficult in Afghanistan for much longer than that. It goes back centuries. The Taliban did not bring in a radical new ideology to Afghanistan. The truth of it is that this struggle to emancipate women in Afghanistan goes back a long time. In the 1920s, the Afghan king decided that women should not wear a veil anymore, that women should not marry before the age of 16, that it would be illegal, that women should have equal rights, that women should go to school. He started a program to send women, young girls, to Turkey, to Germany, to France, to become educated and come home. He tried to pass into law a whole series of reforms that were aimed at giving women much more autonomy.